A new group is formed opposing Andrew Yang's run for New York mayor. Asian and Pacific Islander New Yorkers against Yang. The group names various issues that they have with Yang, saying that he perpetuates racist stereotypes, that he's pro-police, allies with big business, and more. And the current effort has 403 signatures.
Democratic strategist Roger Fisk and culture editor at The Federalist, Emily Jashinsky, are back to weigh in.
So, Emily, let's start with you. Crystal and I have observed this with great annoyance. A lot of the most woke Asians hate Andrew Yang because of his math slogan and all of that, and yet are unable to reconcile themselves with the fact that the majority of Asian voters in New York City love Andrew Yang, not just because of his Asian, but also because of some of the policy stuff and really just the general affect of his campaign. So I think that this, Ryan is the one who found this one, actually, and I found it pretty hilarious, but what's your take?
Well, it's funny because they're doing that thing where they also speak for the rest of the community, where if you look at polls, it's just not the case. But I think that's sort of like an irritating, I don't know, like I actually really believe in the concept of representation, and I'm sure that I agree with this group on that point. And if you believe and agree with that, this is like Andrew Yang is a really, really important figure in that community in terms of representation. And he's very, very, he's interesting, he's dynamic, and he's honestly like transformed into a great politician because he's not a politician. He's sort of like a smart kind of counterpoint to the Trumpian moment, right? Someone who comes from the business community and is super unorthodox and laid back. Anyway, my point just is broadly that it's very irritating when people claim to speak for the community and they're largely elites who have gone through the fanciest schools and therefore have the fanciest, most avant-garde opinions on our woke politics, and then are sort of purporting to speak for the broader community. And in reality, it just, if you look at polling, that's not the case.
Yeah, and Roger, it's kind of the last ditchness of it to me what struck me as part of it. It feels like a kind of desperate last hurl that the kind of the left is throwing at Andrew Yang, rather than kind of stepping back and asking, why is it when the general issues that we support poll extremely well across the city, why is it that we're getting our hat handed to us by Andrew Yang in this race? Instead, a group comes up called Asians Against Andrew Yang. Like, this will be the thing that undoes his mayoral candidacy. Where do you think this is headed?
Well, it's very interesting when a candidate is overtly identified with a particular racial group, and I have a little bit of experience with that. And then leaders within that racial group, kind of at some point raise their hands and say, you're not spending enough attention, you're not paying enough attention to us. When I read that document, it's a classic example. There's about 12 bullet points in the petition. They really should have cut that in about half. One of them is he supported a hate crimes task force instead of community favored guidelines or whatever that means. In which case this document could just as easily have slammed him for not supporting the hate crimes task force.
Yes, exactly. Right.
There's another one in there that he went to some particular meeting instead of going to like a Muslim awareness thing or whatever. And I know from the scheduling in advance world, obviously, for every one thing a candidate or a principal does, that's probably 35 or 40 that they didn't do. So to sift through that stack of declined invites and try to use that as some kind of indication of animus, I think is pretty weak. What's interesting is that he needs to obviously go out and talk as a broader candidate. And the funny thing for me is mayoral contests don't tend to necessarily be all that atmospheric, right? It's essentially kind of it's a geographic thing. It's a constituency thing rather than necessarily kind of a messaging thing. Who can you turn out and from where, really? So the question is like, how many votes do these leaders ostensibly truly represent? And is that in a crowded field, is the impact of their withholding that support, which maybe collectively amounts to 6 or 8 or 10,000 votes, maybe to be kind, is that enough in a crowded field against other people to make a difference? It very well could. Yeah. But it feels to me like it's kind of bolstering or falsely enhancing the profile of some issues to try to create a divide that I don't think is necessarily as wide as they want to present it as.
I think you're right. And that's where it all comes for me, for Emily, which is that, Crystal pointed this out. There was some article which slammed Andrew Yang for not speaking out first against that shooting down in Atlanta. So they were like, Andrew Yang is anti-Asian because he wasn't the first candidate to put out. Maybe he was busy. Like maybe something else was going on. Why are we policing who puts out a statement first? He put out a statement within 6 hours or something like that. Is that not enough? I think it just goes to, and this is what I want you to weigh in on. There is a deep media hatred of Yang. I think it comes from the fact that he circumvented the entire political process and now lands on top. And they frankly don't have a lot of access to his campaign, and he doesn't really owe them anything in the way that a lot of other establishment people in New York City do.
I can't really even add anything to that argument because I think that's exactly dead on. That's exactly what it is. It's that, he's different. He's not different in a Marianne Williamson way, but he's different in a way that he actually has been formidable. He's actually found success, and he totally circumvented their system. And they think he's sort of silly. They don't take him seriously, which is not how voters are reacting or have reacted over the past couple of years to Andrew Yang. It's totally different. And this list, when we're getting into the nitpicking, as you guys have sort of described, they're literally latching on to scheduling conflicts and tweets that weren't sent more quickly than other people's tweets. That kind of nitpicking just reminds me of how ridiculous our political class is. It's a bunch of navel-gazing graduates of fancy colleges who just want to wax philosophical or wax identity politics instead of actually taking care of substance or talking about the substance. They're mired, or they're just completely distracted by the surface level debate about identity politics, which sometimes can be substantive, but largely in so many cases, they just use it as an excuse to, have these conversations and feel good about themselves.
Yeah, and Roger, on that point, to me, the biggest vulnerability that Yang has, and he has a lot of them, is can he actually do the job? Can
right.
Can he run the city of New York? But the left has not really made that argument against him. Instead, throwing all of these kind of memes at him that then kind of blow up and actually just end up making him look more popular, and as he continues to rise in the polls. The response to that is say, well, the polls must be wrong. They're not talking to the right people. Why do you think it is that they can't land what seems to be a fairly easy punch on the question of whether he's ready for this job?
Yeah, I mean, to amplify Emily's point and Sagar's in a way, I mean, the gatekeepers do not like it when people circumvent the gate, right? The thing that, and to my point from my last response a little bit, and I know a little bit about some of the issues that mayors face, but his brand is kind of tech, innovation. We've mentioned the math pin, et cetera. But for mayors, when you get down to it, it's for example, there's this innocuous sounding issue, combined sewer overflow, okay? Oof. Every single mayor, anyone who works in municipal government out there knows what that means. Police overtime, teachers unions, snow removal. Yep. Those are the things.
Salt.
Look at
literally
how,
salting.
How mayors get their job and then how they keep them. If you look, for example, anytime a snowstorm hits a city, you will see that mayor out there riding in those plows and doing a veil 7 times a day, et cetera, because they need to demonstrate on the ground kind of mechanical competence, right? It's not a messaging exercise at all. So that'll be very, very interesting when he gets into nitty gritty about the budget. And then back on your Moss comments, another thing that tends to erupt in these mayoral races are zoning and development issues.
That's true.
The intersection of environmental concerns and neighborhood redevelopment, and that brings in kind of racial components. Right. I'm sure there's a couple things like that in New York that he's going to get asked about, and he better be prepared, because that's where people really demonstrate mayoral competence, which is much different than having, kind of a larger issue-based brand.
That's a good point, Roger. And now we can relitigate Hudson Yards all over again. Okay, guys, stick with us. Next on Rising, journalist Ed Jelani is going to discuss Apple being grilled on questionable billing practices. That's when Rising continues.